How to get cooperation. How to get cooperation. Don't you have much more faith in ideas that you discover for yourself than in ideas that are handed to you on a silver platter? If so, isn't it bad judgment to try to ram your opinions down the throats of other people? Isn't it wiser to make suggestions and let the other person think out the conclusion? Adolph Sells of Philadelphia, manager in an automobile showroom and a student in one of my courses, suddenly found himself confronted with the necessity of injecting enthusiasm into a discouraged and disorganized group of automobile salespeople. Calling a sales meeting, he urged his people to tell him exactly what they expected from him. As they talked, he wrote ideas on the blackboard. He then said, "I'll give you all these qualities you expect from me. Now, I want you to tell me what I have a right to expect from you." The replies came quick and fast: loyalty, honesty, initiative, optimism, teamwork, 8 hours a day of enthusiastic work. The meeting ended with a new courage, a new inspiration. One salesperson volunteered to work 14 hours a day, and Mr. Sells reported to me that the increase of sales was phenomenal. The people had made a sort of moral bargain with me, said Mr. Sells, and as long as I lived up to my part in it, they were determined to live up to theirs. Consulting them about their wishes and desires was just the shot in the arm they needed. No one likes to feel that he or she is being sold something or told to do a thing. We much prefer to feel that we are buying of our own accord or acting on our own ideas. We like to be consulted about our wishes, our wants, our thoughts. Take the case of Eugene Wesson. He lost countless thousands of dollars in commissions before he learned this truth. Mr. Wesson sold sketches for a studio that created designs for stylists and textile manufacturers. Mr. Wesson had called on one of the leading stylists in New York once a week, every week for 3 years. "He never refused to see me," said Mr. Wesson, "but he never bought. He always looked over my sketches very carefully and then said, 'No, Wesson, I guess we don't get any today.'" After 150 failures, Wesson realized he must be in a mental rut, so he resolved to devote one evening a week to the study of influencing human behavior to help him develop new ideas and generate new enthusiasm. He decided on this new approach. With half a dozen unfinished artist sketches under his arm, he rushed over to the buyer's office. "I want you to do me a little favor, if you will," he said. "Here are some uncompleted sketches. Won't you please tell me how we could finish them up in such a way that you could use them?" The buyer looked at the sketches for a while without uttering a word. Finally, he said, "Leave these with me for a few days, Wesson, and then come back and see me." Wesson returned 3 days later, got his suggestions, took the sketches back to the studio, and had them finished according to the buyer's ideas. The result? All accepted. After that, this buyer ordered scores of other sketches from Wesson, all drawn according to the buyer's ideas. "I realized why I had failed for years to sell him," said Mr. Wesson. "I had urged him to buy what I thought he ought to have. Then I changed my approach completely. I urged him to give me his ideas. This made him feel that he was creating the designs, and he was. I didn't have to sell him, he bought." Letting the other person feel that the idea is his or hers not only works in business and politics, it works in family life as well. Paul M. Davis of Tulsa, Oklahoma, told his class how he applied this principle. "My wife and I enjoyed one of the most interesting sightseeing vacation trips we have ever taken. I had long dreamed of visiting such historic sites as the Civil War battlefield at Gettysburg, Independence Hall in Philadelphia, and our nation's capital, Valley Forge, Jamestown, and the restored colonial village of Williamsburg were high on the list of things I wanted to see. In March, my wife Nancy mentioned that she had ideas for our summer vacation, which included a tour of the western states, visiting points of interest in New Mexico, Arizona, California, and Nevada. She had wanted to make this trip for several years, but we couldn't obviously make both trips. Our daughter, Anne, had just completed a course in US history in junior high school and had become very interested in the events that had shaped our country's growth. I asked her how she would like to visit the places she had learned about on our next vacation. She said she would love to. 2 evenings later, as we sat around the dining table, Nancy announced that if we all agreed, the summer vacation would be to the eastern states, that it would be a great trip for Anne and thrilling for all of us. We all concurred. This same psychology was used by an X-ray manufacturer to sell his equipment to one of the largest hospitals in Brooklyn. This hospital was building an addition and preparing to equip it with finest X-ray department in America. Dr. L, who was in charge of the X-ray department, was overwhelmed with sales representatives, each caroling the praises of his own company equipment. One manufacturer, however, was more skillful. He knew far more about handling human nature than the others did. He wrote a letter something like this. Our factory has recently completed a new line of X-ray equipment. The first shipment of these machines has just arrived at our office. They are not perfect. We know that, and we want to improve them. So we should be deeply obliged to you if you could find time to look them over and give us your ideas about how they can be made more serviceable to your profession. Knowing how occupied you are, I shall be glad to send my car for you at any hour you specify. I was surprised to get that letter, Dr. L said as he related the incident before the class. I was both surprised and complimented. I had never had an X-ray manufacturer seeking my advice before. It made me feel important. I was busy every night that week, but I canceled a dinner appointment in order to look over the equipment. The more I studied it, the more I discovered for myself how much I liked it. Nobody had tried to sell it to me. I felt that the idea of buying that equipment for the hospital was my own. I sold myself on its superior qualities and ordered it installed. Ralph Waldo Emerson, in his essay Self-Reliance, stated, "In every work of genius, we recognize our own rejected thoughts. They come back to us with a certain alienated majesty." Colonel Edward M. House wielded an enormous influence in national and international affairs, while Woodrow Wilson occupied the White House. Wilson leaned upon Colonel House for secret counsel and advice more than he did upon even members of his own cabinet. What method did the colonel use in influencing the president? Fortunately, we know, for House himself revealed it to Arthur D. Howden Smith, and Smith quoted House in an article in the Saturday Evening Post. After I got to know the president, House said, I learned the best way to convert him to an idea was to plant it in his mind casually, but so as to interest him in it, so as to get him thinking about it on his own account. The first time this worked, it was an accident. I had been visiting him at the White House and urged a policy on him which he appeared to disapprove. But several days later, at the dinner table, I was amazed to hear him trot out my suggestion as his own. Did House interrupt him and say, "That's not your idea, that's mine"? Oh no, not House. He was too adroit for that. He didn't care about credit. He wanted results. So he let Wilson continue to feel that the idea was his. House did even more than that. He gave Wilson public credit for these ideas. Let's remember that everyone we come in contact with is just as human as Woodrow Wilson. So let's use Colonel House's technique. A man up in the beautiful Canadian province of New Brunswick used this technique on me and won my patronage. I was planning at the time to do some fishing and canoeing in New Brunswick, so I wrote the tourist bureau for information. Evidently, my name and address were put on a mailing list, for I was immediately overwhelmed with scores of letters and booklets and printed testimonials from camp and guides. I was bewildered. I didn't even know which to choose. Then one camp owner did a clever thing. He sent me the names and telephone numbers of several New York people who had stayed at his camp, and he invited me to telephone them and discover for myself what he had to offer. I found to my surprise that I knew one of the men on his list. I telephoned him, found out what his experience had been, and then wired the camp the date of my arrival. The others had been trying to sell me on their service, but one let me sell myself. That organization won 25 centuries ago. Lao Tse, a Chinese sage, said some things that readers of this book might use today. The reason why rivers and seas receive the homage of 100 mountain streams is that they keep below them. Thus, they are able to reign over all mountain streams. So the sage, wishing to be above men, putteth himself below them. Wishing to be before them, he putteth himself behind them. Thus, though his place be above men, they do not feel his weight. Though his place be before them, they do not count it an injury. Principle 7. Let the other person feel that the idea is his or hers. Chapter 17. A formula that will work wonders for you. Remember that other people may be totally wrong, but they don't think so. Don't condemn them. Any fool can do that. Try to understand them. Only wise, tolerant, exceptional people even try to do that. There is a reason why the other man thinks and acts as he does. Ferret out that reason, and you have the key to his actions, perhaps to his personality. Try honestly to put yourself in his place. If you say to yourself, how would I feel? How would I react if I were in his shoes? You will save yourself time and irritation, for by becoming interested in the cause, we are less likely to dislike the effect. And in addition, you will sharply increase your skills in human relationships. Stop a minute, says Kenneth M. Good in his book, How to Turn People into Gold. Stop a minute to contrast your keen interest in your own affairs with your mild concern about anything else. Realize then that everybody else in the world feels exactly the same way. Then, along with Lincoln and Roosevelt, you will have grasped the only solid foundation for interpersonal relationships, namely, that success in dealing with people depends on a sympathetic grasp of other person's viewpoint. Sam Douglas of Hempstead, New York, used to tell his wife that she spent too much time working on their lawn, pulling weeds, fertilizing, cutting the grass twice a week, when the lawn didn't look any better than it had when they moved into their home 4 years earlier. Naturally, she was distressed by his remarks, and each time he made such remarks, the balance of the evening was ruined. After taking our course, Mr. Douglas realized how foolish he had been all those years. It never occurred to him that she enjoyed doing that work and she might really appreciate a compliment on her diligence. One evening after dinner, his wife said she wanted to pull some weeds and invited him to keep her company. He first declined, but then thought better of it and went out after her and began to help her pull weeds. She was visibly pleased, and together they spent an hour in hard work and pleasant conversation. After that, he often helped her with the gardening and complimented her on how fine the lawn looked. What a fantastic job she was doing with a yard where the soil was like concrete. Result, a happier life for both because he had learned to look at things from her point of view, even if the subject was only weeds. In his book, Getting Through to People, Dr. Gerald S. Nirenberg commented, cooperativeness in conversation is achieved when you show what you consider the other person's ideas and feelings, that you consider the other person's ideas and feelings as important as your own. Starting your conversation by giving the other person the purpose or direction of your conversation, governing what you say by what you would want to hear if you were the listener, and accepting his or her viewpoint will encourage the listener to have an open mind to your ideas. Dr. Gerald S. Nirenberg, Getting Through to People. This is on page 31 of the book. I've always enjoyed walking and riding in a park near my home. Like the druids of ancient Gaul, I all but worship an oak tree. So I was distressed season after season to see the young trees and shrubs killed off by needless fires. These fires weren't caused by careless smokers. They were almost all caused by youngsters who went out to the park to go native and cook a frankfurter or an egg under the trees. Sometimes these fires raged so fiercely that the fire department had to be called out to fight the conflagration. There was a sign on the edge of the park saying that anyone who started a fire was liable to fine and imprisonment. But the sign stood in an unfrequented part of the park, and few of the culprits ever saw it. A mounted policeman was supposed to look after the park, but he didn't take his duties too seriously. And the fire continued to spread season after season. On one occasion, I rushed up to a policeman and told him about a fire spreading rapidly through the park and wanted him to notify the fire department. And he nonchalantly replied that it was none of his business because it wasn't in his precinct. I was desperate. So after that, when I went riding, I acted as a self-appointed committee of one to protect the public domain. In the beginning, I'm afraid I didn't even attempt to see the other people's point of view. When I saw a fire blazing under the trees, I was so unhappy about it, so eager to do the right thing that I did the wrong thing. I would ride up to the boys, warn them that they could be jailed for starting a fire, order with a tone of authority that it be put out, and if they refused, I would threaten to have them arrested. I was merely unloading my feelings without thinking of their point of view. The result? They obeyed sullenly and with resentment. After I rode on over the hill, they probably rebuilt the fire and longed to burn up the whole park. With the passing of the years, I acquired a trifle more knowledge of human relations, a little more tact, a somewhat greater tendency to see things from the other person's standpoint. Then, instead of giving orders, I would ride up to a blazing fire and begin something like this. Having a good time, boys? What are you going to cook for supper? I loved to build fires myself when I was a boy, and I still love to. But they are very dangerous here in the park. I know you boys don't mean to do any harm, but other boys aren't so careful. They come along and see that you have built a fire, so they build one and don't put it out when they go home, and it spreads among the dry leaves and kills the trees. We won't have any trees here at all if we aren't more careful. You could be put in jail for building this fire, but I don't want to be bossy and interfere with your pleasure. I like to see you enjoy yourselves. But won't you please rake all the leaves away from the fire right now? And you will be careful to cover it with dirt, a lot of dirt before you leave, won't you? And the next time you want to have some fun, won't you please build your fire over the hill there in the sandpit? It can't do any harm there. Thanks so much, boys. Have a good time. What a difference That kind of talk made. It made the boys want to cooperate. No sullenness, no resentment. They hadn't been forced to obey orders. They had saved their faces. They felt better, and I felt better because I had handled the situation with consideration for their point of view. Seeing things through another person's eyes may ease tensions when personal problems become overwhelming. Elizabeth Novak of New South Wales, Australia, was 6 weeks late with her car payment. On a Friday, she reported, I received a nasty phone call from the man who was handling my account, informing me if I did not come up with $122 by Monday morning, I could anticipate further action from the company. I had no way of raising the money over the weekend. So when I received his phone call, first thing on Monday morning, I expected the worst. Instead of becoming upset, I looked at the situation from his point of view. I apologized most sincerely for causing him so much inconvenience and remarked that I must be his most troublesome customer, as this was not the first time I was behind in my payments. His tone of voice changed immediately, and he reassured me that I was far from being one of his really troublesome customers. He went on to tell me several examples of how rude his customers sometimes are, how they lied to him and often tried to avoid talking to him at all. I said nothing. I listened and let him pour out his troubles to me. Then, without any suggestions from me, he said it did not matter if I couldn't pay all the money immediately. It would be all right if I paid him $20 by the end of the month and made up the balance whenever it was convenient for me to do so. Tomorrow, before asking anyone to put out a fire or buy your product or contribute to your favorite charity, why not pause and close your eyes and try to think the whole thing from another person's point of view? Ask yourself, why should he or she want to do it? True, this will take time, but it will avoid making enemies and will get better results, and with less friction and less shoe leather. I would rather walk the sidewalk in front of a person's office for 2 hours before an interview, said Dean Donahue of the Harvard Business School, than step into that office without a perfectly clear idea of what I was going to say and what that person, from my knowledge of his or her interests and motives, was likely to answer. That is so important that I am going to repeat it in italics for the sake of emphasis. I would rather walk the sidewalk in front of a person's office for 2 hours before an interview than step into that office without a perfectly clear idea of what I was going to say and what that person, from my knowledge of his or her interests and motives, was likely to answer. If, as a result of reading this book, you get only one thing, an increased tendency to think always in terms of the other person's point of view and see things from that person's angle as well as your own, if you get only that one thing from this book, it may easily prove to be one of the stepping stones of your career. Principle 8, try honestly to see things from the other person's point of view. Chapter 18, what everybody wants. Wouldn't you like to have a magic phrase that would stop arguments, eliminate ill feelings, create goodwill, and make the other person listen attentively? Yes? All right, here it is. I don't blame you one iota for feeling as you do. If I were you, I would undoubtedly feel just as you do. An answer like that will soften the most cantankerous old cuss alive. And you can say that and be 100% sincere, because if you were the other person, you, of course, would feel just as he does. Take Al Capone, for example. Suppose you had inherited the same body and temperament and mind that Al Capone had. Suppose you had his environment and experiences. You would then be precisely what he was and where he was. For it is those things and only those things that made him what he was. The only reason, for example, that you are not a rattlesnake is that your mother and father weren't rattlesnakes. You deserve very little credit for being what you are. And remember, the people who come to you irritated, bigoted, unreasoning deserve very little discredit for being what they are. Feel sorry for the poor devils. Pity them, sympathize with them. Say to yourself, there, but for the grace of God, I go I. Three-fourths of people you will ever meet are hungering and thirsting for sympathy. Give it to them, and they will love you. I once gave a broadcast about the author of Little Women, Louisa May Alcott. Naturally, I knew she had lived and written her immortal book in Concord, Massachusetts. But without thinking that what I was saying, I spoke of visiting her old home in Concord, New Hampshire. If I had said New Hampshire only once, it might have been forgiven. But alas and alas, I said it twice. I was deluged with letters and telegrams, stinging messages that swirled around my defenseless head like a swarm of hornets. Many were indignant, a few insulting. One colonial dame who had been reared in Concord, Massachusetts, and who was then living in Philadelphia, vented her scorching wrath upon me. She couldn't have been much more bitter if I had accused Miss Alcott of being a cannibal from New Guinea. As I read the letter, I said to myself, thank God I'm not married to that woman. I felt like writing and telling her that although I had made a mistake in geography, she had made a far greater mistake in common courtesy. But, sorry, that was to be just my opening sentence. Then I was going to roll up my sleeves and tell her what I really thought. But I didn't. I controlled myself. I realized that any hot-headed fool could do that, and that most fools would do just that. I wanted to be above fools, so I resolved to try to turn her hostility into friendliness. It would be a challenge, a sort of game I could play. I said to myself, after all, if I were she, I would probably feel just as she does. So I determined to sympathize with her viewpoint. The next time I was in Philadelphia, I called her on the telephone. The conversation went something like this. Me, Mrs. So and so, you wrote me a letter a few weeks ago, and I want to thank you for it. She, in incisive, cultured, well-bred tone. To whom I have the honor of speaking? Me. I am a stranger to you. My name is Dale Carnegie. You listened to a broadcast I gave about Louisa May Alcott a few Sundays ago, and I made the unforgivable blunder of saying that she had lived in Concord, New Hampshire. It was a stupid blunder, and I want to apologize for it. It was so nice of you to take the time to write me. I'm sorry, Mr. Carnegie, that I wrote as I did. I lost my temper. I must apologize. Me, no, you are not the one to apologize. I am. Any school child would have known better than to have said what I said. I apologized over the air the following Sunday, and I want to apologize to you now personally. She, I was born in Concord, Massachusetts. My family has been prominent in Massachusetts affairs for 2 centuries, and I'm very proud of my native state. I was really quite distressed to hear you say that Miss Alcott had lived in New Hampshire, but I'm really ashamed of that letter. Me, I assure you that you were not 1/10 as distressed as I am. My error didn't hurt Massachusetts, but it did hurt me. It is so seldom that people of your standing in culture take the time to write to people who speak on the radio. And I do hope you will write me again if you detect an error in my talks. She, I really like very much the way you have accepted my criticism. You must be a very nice person. I should like to know you better. So, because I had apologized and sympathized with her point of view, she began apologizing and sympathizing with my point of view. I had the satisfaction of controlling my temper, the satisfaction of returning kindness for an insult. I got infinitely more real fun out of making her like me than I could ever have gotten out of telling her to go and take a jump in the Schuylkill River. Every man who occupies the White House is faced almost daily with thorny problems in human relations. President Taft was no exception, and he learned from experience the enormous chemical value of sympathy in neutralizing the acid of hard feelings. In his book, Ethics in Service, Taft gives rather an amusing illustration of how he softened the ire of a disappointed and ambitious mother. A lady in Washington wrote Taft, whose husband had political influence, came and labored with me for 6 weeks or more to appoint her son to a position. She secured the aid of senators and congressmen in formidable number and came with them to see that they spoke with emphasis. The place was one requiring technical qualification. And following the recommendation of the head of the bureau, I appointed somebody else. I then received a letter from the mother saying that I was most ungrateful since I declined to make her a happy woman as I could have done by a turn of my hand. She complained further that she had labored with her state delegation and got all the votes for an administration bill in which I was especially interested, and this was the way I had rewarded her. When you get a letter like that, the first thing you do is to think how you can be severe with a person who had committed an impropriety or even been a little impertinent. Then you may compose an answer. Then, if you are wise, you will put the letter in a drawer and lock the drawer. Take it out in the course of 2 days. Such communication will always bear 2 days delay in answering. And when you take it out after that interval, you will not send it. That is just the course I took. After that, I sat down and wrote her just as polite a letter as I could, telling her I realized a mother's disappointment under such circumstances, but that really the appointment was not left to my mere personal preference, that I had to select a man with technical qualification and had therefore to follow the recommendations of the head of the bureau. I expressed the hope that her son would go on to accomplish what she had hoped for him in the position which he then had. That mollified her. And she wrote me a note saying she was sorry she had written as she had. But the appointment I sent in was not confirmed at once, and after an interval, I received a letter which purported to come from her husband, though it was in the same handwriting as all the others. I was therein advised that due to the nervous prostration that had followed her disappointment in this case, she had to take to her bed and had developed a most serious case of cancer of the stomach. Would I not restore her to health by withdrawing the first name and replacing it by her son's? I had to write another letter, this one to the husband, to say that I hoped the diagnosis would prove to be inaccurate, that I sympathized with him in the sorrow he must have in the serious illness of his wife, but that it was impossible to withdraw the name sent in. The man whom I appointed was confirmed, and within 2 days after I received that letter, we gave a musicale at the White House. The first two people to greet Mrs. Taft and me were this husband and wife, though the wife had so recently been articulo mortis. J. Mangum represented an elevator escalator maintenance company in Tulsa, Oklahoma, which had the maintenance contract for the escalators in one of Tulsa's leading hotels. The hotel manager did not want to shut down the escalator for more than 2 hours at a time because he did not want to inconvenience the hotel's guests. The repair that had to be made would take at least 8 hours, and his company did not always have a specially qualified mechanic available at the convenience of the hotel. When Mr. Mangum was able to schedule a top flight mechanic for this job, telephoned the hotel manager, and instead of arguing with him to give him the necessary time, he said, Rick, I know your hotel is quite busy and you would like to keep the escalator shutdown time to a minimum. I understand your concern about this, and we want to do everything possible to accommodate you. However, our diagnosis of the situation shows that if we do not complete job now, your escalator may suffer more serious damage and that would cause a much longer shutdown. I know you would not want to inconvenience your guests for several days. The manager had to agree that an 8-hour shutdown was more desirable than several days. By sympathizing with the manager's desire to keep his patrons happy, Mr. Mangum was able to win the hotel manager to his way of thinking easily and without rancor. Joyce Norris, a piano teacher in St. Louis, Missouri, told of how she had handled a problem piano teachers often face with teenage girls. Babbitt had exceptionally long fingernails. This is a serious handicap to anyone who wants to develop proper piano playing habits. Mrs. Norris reported, I knew her long fingernails would be a barrier for her in her desire to play well. During our discussions prior to her starting her lessons with me, I did not mention anything to her about her nails. I didn't want to discourage her from taking lessons, and I also knew she would not want to lose that which she took so much pride in and such great care to look attractive. After her first lesson, when I felt time was right, I said, Babbitt, you have attractive hands and beautiful fingernails. If you want to play the piano as well as you are capable of, and as well as you would like to, you would be surprised how much quicker and easier it would be for you if you would trim your nails shorter. Just think about it, okay? She made a face which was definitely negative. I also talked to her mother about this situation, again mentioning how lovely her nails were. After another negative reaction, it was obvious that Babbitt had beautifully manicured nails were important to her. The following week, Babbitt returned for her second lesson. Much to my surprise, the fingernails had been trimmed. I complimented her and praised her for making such a sacrifice. I also thanked her mother for influencing Babbitt to cut her nails. The reply was, Oh, I had nothing to do with it. Babbitt decided to do it on her own, and this is the first time she has ever trimmed her nails for anyone. Did Mrs. Norris threaten Babbitt? Did she say she would refuse to teach a student with long fingernails? No, she did not. She let Babbitt know that her fingernails were a thing of beauty and it would be a sacrifice to cut them. She implied, I sympathize with you. I know it won't be easy, but it will pay off in your better musical development. Saul Baroque was probably America's #1 impresario. For almost half a century, he handled artists, such world-famous artists as Chopin, Isadora Duncan, and Pavlova. Mr. Horrock told me that one of the first lessons he had learned in dealing with his temperamental stars was the necessity for sympathy. Sympathy and more sympathy with their idiosyncrasy. For 3 years, he was impresario for Fyodor Chapin, one of the greatest bassos who ever thrilled the ritzy box holders of the Metropolitan. Yet, Chapin was a constant problem. He carried on like a spoiled child. To put it in Mr. Horrock's own inimitable phrase, he was a hell of a fellow in every way. For example, Chapin would call up Mr. Horrock about noun of the day he was going to sing and say, Saul, I feel terrible. My throat is like a raw hamburger. It is impossible for me to sing tonight. Did Mr. Horrock argue with him? Oh no. He knew that an entrepreneur couldn't handle artists that way. So he would rush over to Chapin's hotel, dripping with sympathy. What a pity, he would moan. What a pity, my poor fellow. Of course you cannot sing. I'll cancel the engagement at once. It will only cost you a couple of $1,000, but that is nothing in comparison to your reputation. Then Chalipin would sigh and say, "Perhaps you'd better come over later in the day. Come at 5 and see how I feel then." At 5 o'clock, Mr. Horrock would again rush to his hotel, dripping with sympathy. Again, he would insist on cancelling the engagement, and again, Chalipin would sigh and say, "Well, maybe you had better come to see me later. I may be better then." At 7:30, the great basso would consent to sing, only with the understanding that Mr. Horrock would walk out on the stage of the Metropolitan and announce that Chalipin had a very bad cold and was not in a good voice. Not in good voice. Mr. Horrock would lie and say he would do it, for he knew that was the only way to get the basso out on the stage. Dr. Arthur I. Gates said in his splendid book, Educational Psychology, "Sympathy the human species universally craves. The child eagerly displays his injury or even inflicts a cut or bruise in order to reap abundant sympathy. For the same purpose, adults show their bruises, relate their accidents, illnesses, especially details of surgical operations. Self pity for misfortunes, real or imaginary, is in some measure practically a universal practice. So, if you want to win people to your way of thinking, put it in practice. Principle 9: be sympathetic with the other person's ideas and desires. We shall end with that. So, would Taranjeet, Tanmay, Chandrasekhar, would any of you like to share? Taranjeet, would you like to share something?
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. The principle 8, what we read, the
Yes.
last paragraph of it, that if we think that other person's point of view matters, and we try to understand the other person's point of view, there could be many struggles or many fights that can be avoided, because throughout this book we have been reading to give importance to the other person.
Yes.
So I really think the way that person who spoke about Lucia Alcott, he could have easily fought with that lady and said, "Oh, how can she write?" or something like that. But he handled it in a very good way.
Yes.
I really wish I can also do that things, because it's really something to learn about. It is very difficult to say something sweet when you are really hurt, or when you are really very angry. Saying something sweet is really very difficult. And then
Yes.
that person took the pains of, when like he did not just leave it there, like when he had a chance to go to the other city, Philadelphia, and then he took the pains of calling that woman up. That
Yes.
was really, really great. It really takes pains. So this is one habit that I wish that I can learn. This is, from the whole book what I have read till now, this is the
Yes.
greatest takeaway, that we have to be very calm, quiet, composite when we are talking about people.
Yes.
Those, especially those who have hurt you, those who have talked something wrong about you, handling them is something really very difficult.
Yes. Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. This is wonderful. Beautiful sharing. Chandrasekhar, yes.
So
Yes.
can I also share one point? Like author
Yes, please.
said, we shall putting fire on the sandy or like any near the rivers, better than we putting in the roadsides or any under the trees. should avoid the putting fire, because it's this author said like if the one leaf became fire, the whole tree or any forest will become a Amazon forest like
Yes.
that time. So author also suggested putting like fire in the sandy or any river side, because it's not at all spread, even though smoking also, if putting more fire on their roadside, the smoke will get on the fire on the trees.
Hmm.
So this other suggested good way we shoot in on sandy or riverside.
Hmm.
I take away this idea and implement in my life also, ma'am.
Yeah. So are you saying that it's proposing a logical reason for doing something, is he just proposed from a logical point of view, reasoning, giving the reasoning for doing something.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Yes,
Yes,
that's
ma'am.
what
Yes, ma'am.
seems like. That's the that's the way we could understand this. That
Yes.
we're not telling anybody directly what to do or not do, but giving a reason why doing something makes more sense than the other thing.
Yes, ma'am. Exactly.
Yeah, very interesting. Thank you for sharing.
Thank you, ma'am. Bye.
Yes. Meera ma'am, would you like to share something? Okay, so I think with that we will close for today, and we'll see you tomorrow again at 10. Yes. Good night.
Bye,
Thank
ma'am.
you.
Good night.
Yeah, good night.
Good
Thank
night,
you.
everyone.
Yeah, good night.